I built $1 million portfolios for companies like Lowe's and Dell, where I held senior executive roles, and went to go up the stairs. And next thing I know, as I came around the bend, I'm staring at the barrel of a gun. I had the mid seven-figure income, the C-suite title, the global influence that comes from being with those companies. What I realized along the way is that I was building a cathedral on a swamp. My resume doesn't matter at all. My bank account doesn't matter. What hit me at that moment was, I'm going to die. It was at that moment that the other thing that flashed in my head was,
So let's start, if we can, let me go back. I know we were just talking about the Army-Navy game coming up, and I'm sure by the time this is out, that will be history. But you had a career in the Navy as naval officer, and now, like, we fast forward to, you've got the book and the podcast, and there's so much that you are doing now to help people with their purpose. I'm kind of curious, like, how did that transition happen? If you could take me a little bit through the history of John.
Jim, thanks for that question. And it's such a big question. It's a hard one to answer, but I'm going to give it a shot. So, Jim, for 2 decades, I was an architect of systems. And what I mean by that is I built $1 million portfolios for companies like Lowe's and Dell, where I held senior executive roles. And on paper, I was the definition of what Brent Gleason calls all in. I had the mid seven-figure income, the C-suite title, the global influence that comes from being with those companies. But what I realized along the way is that I was building a cathedral on a swamp. Externally, I was a vanquisher. Internally, I was what I call in my book a subsister. And I think a huge turning point for me happened in November 2017. It was just a normal day. I had my daughter and was taking her off or dropping her off at school, and did what I did every day. I went to the gym. This was a day I was going to Orange Theory, and they had an electrical fire in their AC system. And so fire trucks came. I went home way earlier than I typically would have. And unbeknownst to me, someone had been canvassing my whereabouts and tracking my routine, which is a good reason for people who are listening to switch up your routine. So I walked into my home and found myself in the middle of a burglary, and I didn't realize it at the time. Was living in a rental and had had people from the rental company into the house. So when I saw some shoes laying in the house, when I walked in, I immediately thought it was probably just a worker from the rental company, and went to go up the stairs. And next thing I know, I had a 90-degree type of bend. And as I came around the bend, I'm staring at the barrel of a gun. And in that split second, my life, as it often does, I switched one thing to downrange, like I was when I was in the military on missions. But the other thing I was thinking also is, my resume doesn't matter at all. My bank account doesn't matter. What hit me at that moment was, I'm going to die. And it was at that moment that the other thing that flashed in my head was, I haven't truly lived yet. I realized that I had spent at that time 47 years earning a living, but I hadn't yet designed a life. And that was the day I decided to stop half baking my potential. And so what came out of that was a season of rediscovery, which is what I wrote about in my book, Passion Struck. I spent 2 years really going through a period of intense self-rediscovery. I had also gone through a divorce. And so I think that is a period of self-discovery as well. But I did tremendous amount of me search, which is what came out in the book. And later, as I keep doing solo podcast episodes, what I talk about oftentimes on the podcast. But I'll leave it there to see where you want to take it.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That's I can't even begin to consider what that must feel like in that moment, to be kind of facing, hey, a life or death scenario, and really truly consider like your next move counts tremendously in that moment. Obviously, it worked out. You're here. Um, I would also imagine that probably led to a lot of like emotional torment in the house. And I mean, there's a ton of fallout that has to come with that as well. No?
Oh man, more than you would ever think. It just so I can't, for legal reasons, go into a lot of details, but the figure who ended up doing this crime was someone I knew. And this person had come into my house a week before to do some work, and I hadn't been there at the time. Knew they were coming in, but what I didn't realize was that they had been using that opportunity to go through all my stuff prior to carrying out this act that they were going to do. And it just makes you feel so vulnerable. And for weeks, I couldn't sleep in my bed. My daughter wouldn't come to the house because not only did they rob me, but she was like 9 or 10 years old, and he actually went into her purse and stole all her money too, and other things in her room. And I think I didn't want to live in the house anymore. I didn't. I slept on the couch. It was hard for me to even go back in my bedroom because that's where he went through most of my stuff. And it's just this weird feeling. I eventually, you know, as a result, got a dog, bought a lot more weapons, bought a lot more video cameras, and I think it changes the whole perspective of what security means to you, especially when you're violated in your own home.
Yeah. And I mean, moving on from that, like then move into the purpose part, right? Because obviously there's going to be a bit of a journey, right? When you're seeking, hey, I built all of this cool stuff, the house, I'm sure, lots of nice trappings come with that. What is the journey like after that moment to then move into, right, seeking purpose for yourself?
So there was another big event that happened right at the same time, within a few days of this incident, and that is I had was lucky to have an amazing friend, Tim. Tim was that guy who always lit people up. He was the one who was never afraid to make a fool of himself, always exerted his courage muscles, whether it was dancing amongst a big group of people, even though he wasn't the greatest dancer, or putting himself out there. He was that one person who, for so many of us, you could call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he was that person who would pick up the call and always had time to hear you out. And 4 or 5 days after this burglary and I had spent all day Saturday with him, kind of processing it. He committed suicide on that Monday. And those two events, as I was processing them as the weeks went on, were just a huge wake up call, because they told me in two different ways. What are you waiting for? And I had felt stuck for a long time, and I think there are many people probably listening to this who've been in that same position where they feel stuck. And for me, that paycheck and what it brought with it had become a major weight on my life, because all of a sudden your whole identity is around the house you have, the cars you're driving, the people you're hanging out with, how much money you have. And that's a difficult thing to give up, even to pursue something you're supposed to pursue. So as I went on this journey, that was the first major thing I had to shift is, you know, what's going to be the worst that happens if I do this and everything fails? The worst thing that's going to happen is people might look at me differently, but if I don't do it, I'm going to regret not pursuing this calling that I've had in the back of my head for so long. And the other thing that I really learned through Tim's life was, he was at this point where he felt invisible in a different way than I felt invisible, but we were both experiencing what I call the Mattering crisis in our own ways. And for him, it led to his death. For me, it was leading me into emotional numbness. But I think, regardless of the outcome, I realized that I was living in that gap that so many people are struggling with today. And So the biggest action that I had to take was actually the first step to make the decision that I was going to just make the choice to do something different when I woke up the next morning. And that difference maker for me was I had pent up PTSD already from years in the military being downrange that I hadn't dealt with. And this burglary re-earthed all of that. And so I knew I had to deal with that or I was going to be stuck forever. So for me, that was the major turning point was finally going to get help to overcome those stuck points.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a powerful story. And it really does make you think about, when you first described your friend Tim there, that, he's the type of person to always be a little bit outgoing and I would imagine like the life of the party type of scenario. How many people like that who are quietly struggling and just you just never know. Right. And I think it's a true testament to the sooner that you can kind of have that conversation with someone, pick up a book, have a conversation, phone a friend, and kind of share that load, the easier it becomes, because how many of us are struggling with something, whether it's the same or similar or could relate to, or at least could hear the other person. But it kind of takes us to kind of be the best version of ourselves first. And maybe not the best version, but at least be on the path to kind of discovering who that version is, right?
Yeah, and a lot of my background is framed from a veteran perspective, but and where I'm going to go with this is, unfortunately, Tim's suicide is not an uncommon event, and even in my Naval Academy class, we have had more classmates die because of suicide than we ever had classmates died in combat situations or in service. And when I think about the 20-year war on terror, I think we lost 5,000, 6,000 American lives. But on the backside of that, during the same period, there were over 150,000 suicides. So it just shows you how many people are struggling. And that's not even, our first responders and everyday humans who are going through their own internal battles. And
Right.
so understanding all of that made me just compelled to do something. And I realized that there's this huge problem out there where so many people were taught as they were growing up that their worth is inherent, not earned. And we've been taught to be rather than just be. And that's where my mission really shifted from boardrooms to creating what I now call the Mattering Verse.
Mm. I love that. And I agree wholeheartedly. So what is the Matterverse? And like explain it for our listeners in simple terms, then we'll kind of get a little deeper into it.
Well, this is certainly something that didn't come to me overnight. I had been given this mission at this point, probably 20 years ago. I was going through a pretty intensive course called Discipleship One, where you go through the entire Bible over 34 weeks. We were meeting with our pastor twice a week in a small group to do this, and during that period of time, I started to get this calling that I was supposed to help the lonely, the broken, the battered, the helpless, the burned out of the world. And I had no idea what any of that meant. And as I've really analyzed this, the one word that kept coming back to me is what are all these people feeling? They're feeling some sense of invisibility in how the world sees them and then how they feel they're showing up in it. And so it really comes into what psychologist Gordon Flett has uh, I named the anti-mattering phenomenon. And so the other side of that is to matter. So looking at this, I thought about how do you approach people and where does this problem begin? So the mattering verse consists of two different ecosystems. On one side, there's the adult ecosystem. So how do you reach adults at scale to start helping solve this? Because those conditions I brought up, loneliness, helplessness, people burned out, each one of those separately is a huge epidemic that's impacting hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So how do you start helping people through that? So When I started to think about this, the first step was I could start a podcast because that can, although it's a one-on-one thing, it can eventually scale. I can do it through books, but then I started thinking bigger. How do you do this at a larger scale? So that became the starting point to create a speakers bureau, podcast network, a live events company where the entire mission is around how do you help people solve the mattering gap. I knew it couldn't just be me. So how do you bring in like-minded creators who are also trying to help people like you are on this show to make people feel visible again? Because there's nothing worse than losing all meaning in your life and having nothing to wake up for. So from an adult standpoint, it was we'll start partnering with a bunch of creators who all have a common set of core values, and they're all kind of doing it in their own lane. Some people do it work related, some people do it relationship related, some people are helping people overcome fear. But all of it is centrally targeted at helping people feel like they matter again. Same thing with the Speakers Bureau, etc. Books, and a future evolution of this would be for us to be our own publishing company, so we can start publishing other people's books to help augment this whole ecosystem. But then on the children's side of this, I started really looking at this. You know, what is causing this to happen? Because it's become a generational issue. As I look at my parents, who were part of the greatest generation, you don't see this as much. But as you see the generations that have come after them, it seems to be growing more and more in prominence. And now, if you look at the most depressed and anxious people on the planet, they're kids and adolescents under 18. We don't know the exact numbers because they're protected because they're under 18, so you can't do as much reporting on it. But the CDC, at least here in the US, says that over 40% of teenagers are in chronic states of hopelessness or sadness. So I started to look at that, and I saw this in my own two kids when they were going through middle school and high school, trying to cope with the evolution of social media, now artificial intelligence, plus the social pressures and everything else. Like at the point when they're in high school, you're almost too late to intervene. So I started to think about where could you intervene in a way that could be more meaningful, and the science led me to the best place to do that is when they're 4 to 8 years old. And so that started to become my target focus. And so that's the other side of the mattering verse, is to create a multimedia emotional ecosystem. Think about the Pixar of emotional intelligence, where we're teaching 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds that they matter before the world tries to convince them otherwise. And my goal is we don't just fix a child, we change the trajectory of the future, not just here in the United States, but hopefully globally.
Yeah. Oh, let me say this. I love the concept, and I agree wholeheartedly, especially like the multi-prong approach of kind of how to attack the issue. Because I think you're right. There are so many kids who grow up where it's become normal for them to have that level of like hopelessness or just discontentment with where they're at in their life, especially when they look at, the definitions of quote unquote success on social media, or maybe they even see in their own house, they've got a mom and dad or whatever the situation is in that house where, maybe they're not super happy. Maybe they're, waking up and plugging along and just doing what they got to do. And that's what life is to them. And I think that it's an issue, like a large issue. At least when I look around our own community, oftentimes when I see kids who are exemplifying those issues, I'll look at what's going on in the house, for at least the ones that I'm aware of. And you can often find the kids are a reflection of the parents, right? So do you think there has to be kind of a multi-layered approach here to help the kids kind of develop a little bit of self-sufficiency when it comes to having them understand that they matter? That almost seems like protective armor to kind of face the world. where they understand, hey, I matter before I hear everything else. Then at the same time, you're also working with maybe the parents, maybe the grandparents, going to help them understand that as well.
I think it's a multi-level approach that you have to do. So I never thought in a million years that I would be a children's author. That is one thing I never pictured myself doing. But as I was writing this book, I discovered it was so much more difficult than writing a nonfiction book, because I was trying to apply not only emotional intelligence into the book, but also behavior science and positive psychology and neuroscience. But but how do you explain that to a 4 or 5 year old? So you have to do it through imagery. And not being an artist myself, uh, I had to work with an illustrator who kind of got what we were trying to do. And so a lot of times when you turn over a children's script, the publisher doesn't even want you to give guidance to the illustrator. I kind of took the opposite approach. I really worked with her so that she understood the scientific layers, the spiritual layers, and the mindfulness layers that we were trying to build in. And working together, we started to see that we could use metaphors and symbols in the illustrations that subtly can shift how a child is seeing things when it mirrors up with the words. But I realized as I was looking at it and had parents read it, because the parents are the ones who have to guide the child afterwards, that they themselves were seeing their own emotional journey through the book as well, which is the other thing I was trying to do, because they're picking up on this more. But the other thing I realized is it doesn't matter if it's a nonfiction book or a children's book. Oftentimes we don't apply what we read, and so I wanted to take this one step further. So not only showing an example of Luma and you matter Luma, but then encouraging the children to take the example that Luma gave them in the book, and now they can do this in their own life. So we've attached it to a course that's going to be coming out that will augment, and if in a school environment or even in a house environment, the ability to go through the book. But in addition to that, we've created something called Pass the Ripple, where children can go to a QR code and it'll take them to that site, and they'll be given access to a ripple code where they can log their own act of kindness and see how far it propagates through the world. And by doing that, I thought it would become this great opportunity for child educator to have this moment where they could discuss this ripple of kindness. And it shows that you don't have to be a superhero. You don't have to be, a professional player to make a difference in the world. One little act of kindness can have a huge ripple effect. And
Mhm.
that was the whole aspect. And I know you're big on the ripple effect idea, so I figured you would like this idea.
Yeah, no, I love it. I've actually never heard of that platform, but I'm definitely gonna have to take a look at that. It's sounds 100% right up my alley.
Well, it is not released yet, but if you want to be a beta tester, I would be happy to give you the link. It
Yeah,
should be live in January.
absolutely. I mean, I would love that. And I mean, even the whole thing we're so in alignment on. My daughter wrote a children's book that came out in May, and actually a second one, which incidentally is coming out today, the date we're recording this. And I agree with you 100%. I think that there are so many topics that you can cover in a children's book that also, and I don't know if it's sneaky or whatever you want to call it, but really speak to the adult reading the book to the kid. And I think that there are so many times, like if you can intentionally simplify something to the point that you can explain it through a children's book, like, man, the impact that it has on the person reading it is, I think, so much harder when they really understand, like, man, these little concepts that, yes, it's a fun kids book, but when you zoom out and realize, like, if you apply that same logic in your life as an adult, how much greater your life would be, but how much joy and how much more fulfillment you would have if you apply these same principles you just read to your kid while they were falling asleep. That's almost this like interesting little way to normalize it for the kids, but also to get that word into the parents. Because I think you might have a different experience one of the things I've seen is no matter how good your content is, you need to get the adult to sit there and want to listen to it and then want to apply it. And I think that to me is one of the largest roadblocks is even if we have a great message and we're saying, hey, here's exactly what you need to do to feel the joy and the appreciation and whatever it is that you want in your life. And the person on the other side of that does want the joy and the freedom and the fulfillment, all that stuff. They immediately then look at, hey, how much work do I have to do and how uncomfortable is that work going to be to get me from where I am right now, which is not great, but at least I'm comfortable in that not greatness to this other thing. And I think a lot of people stay stuck in that state of discomfort because somehow it became normal to them, right? So it's easier to stay stuck than to go through a little bit of discomfort to get the reward on the other side. Does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense, and that was a core part of what I was thinking, because the hope was that when a parent and child are looking at this, that the parent will start realizing maybe some of the decisions that they're making on how present they are with their children, and reconsider what they're doing, because what I fundamentally feel is the breakdown is it's happening in our homes first. It's happening at the dinner table. It's happening in our personal relationships with our partners. And when we're not present, and when we're carrying all this baggage, our kids see how we're showing up and then they start emulating us. So for me, it was trying to reconnect the family in many ways and getting them to think differently, especially the parents.
Yeah. It's such a great way to do it. So you've written one children's book
So
more?
So this thing was so hard to write. I have to tell you that once I finally figured out how to get the cadence, I actually at least wrote a draft for 10 of them. So the first one comes out in February 24th, but the other ones, hopefully in soon order, like your daughters, will start releasing them on a pretty regular cadence.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like it's one of those things where once you kind of tap into it, you just want to keep going because it just feels like, especially when you see the final product, I imagine you've seen like a rough draft at this point. Like it feels like, man, this is an amazing thing. I can't wait to do this literally 10 times over. That's funny. So then you've got this book, this platform, as well as your own book, which is about turning your purpose into your passion or your passion into your purpose. Did I mix that up?
No, it's really the journey to significance. It's how it's if you're a newly graduated college student, how do you build a life of significance? If you're someone like I was, kind of stuck, how do you get unstuck? Or if you're a person in the third chapter of life, how do you find new meaning in your life? So it really was supposed to be applicable to anyone on the life journey.
Do you deal with the topic of defining significance?
I deal with it. I have a book coming out in September, October of 2026, where I dive into this a lot more deeply. That's what the whole book is basically about. But I do touch on it from the standpoint of the first chapter is something called the Mission Angler. And the whole chapter is, I love metaphors. So I use this metaphor of an angler or fisherman to kind of show the issue that I think is happening with many people when it comes to our mission or meaning in life. And that is, um, do you like to fish?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're going to go out and fish, and I live here in Clearwater, and I want to go catch some grouper, it's not like I'm going to wake up 9 a.m. on a Saturday, not have anything planned out, go hop on my boat, point it without any direction, drop anchor, put the line in, and think I'm going to catch any grouper. Any angler I know who's worth anything is planning for this for a long time, because you're looking at moon phases, you're looking at tides, you're looking at weather, you're looking at what is actually in season right now, where are people seeing it, etc. And it's this very calculated thing. But we don't shape our lives that way. We do it more the former. We kind of go after this haphazardly. And so this whole chapter is about how do you think about this differently, and I talk about something called self discrepancy theory, which is really this. If you look at a triangle, it has three different axes. One is um, us in our current life living as we are. And then the other two axes are the life we should be leading versus the life we could be leading. And so many of us end up leading the life we feel we should be leading instead of the one we could be leading. And I think that this
Mhm.
is one of the things that is causing so much of this invisibility that I talk about is we are not living
Mm.
authentically. And
Yeah.
when you don't live authentically, you end up, whether you realize it or not, you're putting a mask on every day, showing up someone completely different than who you are under your skin. And over time, the more you do that, the more it starts to unravel you. And so this whole chapter is really about how do you find a problem that's worth solving? Thinking about this from an entrepreneur standpoint, like what is the problem worth solving that only you innately can solve? And that if you look at Viktor Frankl, that could come in three different ways. One, it could come through work. The problem you might be solving could be taking care of a child who's got a disability who gives you meaning, or taking care of an aging parent, or even loving your partner or your family, that could give you meaning. Or you might be facing a season of suffering that, like he did in the concentration camp, that can give you meaning. Or the other element I bring in is the work of Dacher Keltner and moral beauty, showing that random acts of kindness can also give you meaning and is probably the most common way that we feel awe in our lives. So I kind of encourage going down one of those paths to finding meaning again. And then through that, finding the problem that only you can uniquely go after, whatever it is on those archetypes, and then applying your unique skills to it.
I love that. And when I originally asked that question, kind of my line of thought was, I feel like what holds a lot of people back is this belief that they themselves are not significant. And, obviously I have not read your book yet, but what I think people need to understand, at least my perspective, and I want to hear yours on it, is that they just need to understand in what capacity and then lean into it. And I feel like once you get that understanding, it's much easier to then take that next step. Once you do understand, hey, you are significant, and no matter what you're facing right now, it might feel like the biggest mountain you've ever even attempted to climb, and it's impossible and whatever else. But I feel like once you get at least that base understanding of, hey, your story matters and it is significant, even if you can't see it right now, it gives you just enough of a breadcrumb to really continue to pursue like the rest of that story. I'm just really curious on like your perspective, and because I think that speaks to the same thing about really motivating someone to take that initial step. And I don't have to tell you, once you take that initial step, the second step becomes way easier. But that first step for a lot of people could be a challenge.
Well, this goes back to where I started from. This whole point that, like, on the outside, I was the architect of these multi-billion-dollar ecosystems, and it all looked great, but I was living in an emotional desert. And I think that that is something that so many people are waking up to is you get down the track in your 30s, 40s, and you realize you've climbed the wrong peak. And so I think when that happens, and that's one side of it, you feel that unmattering that you just described. But I think the other thing that happens is we don't realize that the systems that we are a part of are taking mattering away from us piece by piece, gradually. And it starts from the time that we're in school. It starts when how you're valued in school is by the grades you're getting, and this performance that it's never enough unless you're getting A's and grades and everything else. It's
Mhm.
in social media when the major platforms that we're using aren't celebrating community. They're all tailored to profiting off of you as an individual. And so they're manipulating you in the same way. Our work environments are manipulating us because the focus for decades hasn't been on belonging as a significant metric of business success. It's profits and shareholder value at the expense of people. And when you couple that in with AI, it's making people feel more discomfort than they ever have. So it's this systematic erosion that's happening. And a great example, if anyone's a Malcolm Gladwell fan, he covered the Bureau of Roseto, Pennsylvania, in his books. And Roseto was this town that was formed by Italian immigrants. And when psychologists started studying it, they couldn't figure out why it was so different. The people there were living with more meaning. They were living longer lives. They were living healthier lives. And so they thought surely it must be something that was different in their diet. But they quickly saw that their diet was worse than 95% of the diet in the world. But what they found was that there was this huge community within it where, on Sunday evening, your table would be overflowing with people, and there was this huge community integration. But over time, what ended up happening is people stopped staying, they started moving away. People stopped caring for their elders, stopped treating the elders with as much respect, and slowly the town started to disintegrate to the point that Sunday meal became, instead of that large family gathering, two or three people. And if you look at this across America, because that's what you and I are most familiar with, I mean, that's exactly what I've seen transpire over my life time, is that whole ecosystem of community is breaking down for so many of us. And so if we don't have that community that's telling us we matter, and we start feeling we don't matter and no one's reinforcing it, you're not reinforcing to other people that they matter either, because you're not feeling it. And all of a sudden you've got this cycle that starts happening where you don't feel it, people aren't reinforcing it, so you're not telling your kids they matter. And so now we've created an immune disorder because it's no longer there. And that's what
Yeah.
I was talking about, that it's um, it self propagates.
Yeah. And, what I'm hearing you say there too is it's really about a sense of belonging, right? Belonging to a thing, to a community, to a culture. And one of the things I think is kind of fallout from a lack of that in our communities is how people have then started clinging to these little echo chambers they find through social media, where it's their political view or their cultural view or whatever it is. And they cling to that because that's become their identity, right? So they find this little ecosystem of people who believe the same thing that they believe. And now they need to defend that life or death, because if that thing falls apart, if it becomes untrue, they cease to exist because that has become their identity. Right? And I think, much to your point, if there was that community aspect where we belong to a community and we had some, shared common goal as a community outside of whatever the nonsense online is, we wouldn't be so susceptible to, that crap, to put it politely.
Well, I think that is a huge part of it, but I think it also has to do with our own makeup, and I'm the first person guilty of this. So I was listening to one of your podcast episodes, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I was immediately bought into it because it had a Chick-fil-A tie to it, and my brother is an executive at Chick-fil-A. So in this story, this gentleman had worked at Chick-fil-A when he was in high school and college, and then was given a Chick-fil-A, I guess, when he was 22 or 23, and started developing the wealth that you can get from owning that franchise. But he decided that he wanted to give his wealth away over his lifetime, and he's doing it in, if I have it correctly, in Niger, I think. And
Yes.
and so if I look at my own life, and I'm completely honest here, in my book, I have 5 different layers of what it means to become passion struck, and it starts with a subsister, meaning you're subsisting at life. It goes to an imposter because you're kind of following groupthink and what others do. It goes to a vanquisher, then to an orchestrator, than to a creative amplifier who's trying to create systematic change. Throughout most of my career, I was a vanquisher. I was very good at embracing the suck and conquering obstacles, but I was doing it for personal gain. And so, what struck me with your guest was even from an early age, he was really a creative amplifier in what he was trying to do. He was trying to create a difference in the world. And um, that is where I'm trying to get more and more people headed, is to stop looking at life for personal gain and start looking at it for systematic gain of helping and suffering in the world, which is
Yeah.
what I think all of us at our heart. I mean, that's, I don't care whether it's Buddhism, you're a Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Catholic, whatever, Judaism. I think that's what all of us are put here to do. But that's not how we're living.
Right. Do you think there's a component of that is how you're raised, where it becomes normal to be that kind of creative amplifier because that's what you see your parents do and it's what you see in your community? So you're not necessarily acting out of yourself being a creative amplifier, but it's more so, hey, this is just what's normal to you, like the activities and the mindset and whatever else, because that is how you were raised.
I think that can definitely play into it in a big way. You know, I mean, I'll give an example. The church I go to in Clearwater, Florida, the pastor has been a pastor at that church for 30 years now. For most of it, he was a youth pastor before becoming the main pastor, but his entire family is now part of the church. His son is an executive pastor. His wife is part of it. They've got cousins and other relatives that are part of it. So you grow up in this ecosystem of service, and it doesn't. I'm just using a church example. It could be any example, but you've kind of grown up with it, and so that becomes part of your psyche. But if you are growing up in a family that doesn't volunteer, that never gives back, etc., I mean, that also becomes a learned behavior. So what I have found and what I talk about in the book is that all of this, just like courage is a muscle, our ability to change is also possible. I mean, it is one of the main things that behavior science teaches us. You just have to change from that early grounding, whatever it was, and reorient yourself to a different way of thinking.
I love that. You know what? I also feel like it really helps a parent, which I mean, most of the people listening to this podcast are probably not going to be kids, right? So, we're talking someone in their 30s, 40s. For that person to be able to start stepping into this allows you to then shift the entire future of your entire, family tree by stepping into the uncomfortable, by kind of embracing that suck, figuring out how to kind of get back to your core identity to pursue your purpose and your passion. Then you can then kind of, climb that ladder, if you will, to be that creative amplifier and then set the tone for the future generations. And I feel like what could be freaking cooler than that, to be the person who changed the course of your family's history?
Yeah, I will tell you like one thing I found for my family. I mean, my family, we volunteered, we were very active in the church, but my upbringing, both my grandparents and my parents had very high expectations on what we would do with our lives. And I always felt that I was constantly having to prove myself to earn any um, worth with them. And so this comes back to what you were referring to, and that is our emotional scaffolding happens during those early years as we're growing up, and it shapes whether you want to volunteer or what you choose success and happiness mean, which for me became achievement culture. But you're absolutely right. If we can start attacking that, which is the whole thing I'm trying to do with the mattering verse, you can change that emotional scaffolding to give a new way to think about life and what it means to be all in. Because I don't know
Yeah.
about you can't like drive your life for success or try to drive yourself for happiness. Those are outcomes of living a life of meaning.
Right. Yeah. They're byproducts of the process. What I love about this too is that, and I don't want to overly simplify this process, but to me, it seems so simple in the terms of like, you don't need to go to an 8-year college. You don't need to take out student loans. You don't need to do all of this insane stuff. You need to start having conversations, maybe buy a book, read a book. Woohoo, read a book. But like, you need to start having some conversations, getting around community, being part of something bigger than you. Like, it's really relatively simple if you just make the commitment to start building a better life for yourself and getting out of the current version of yourself that you're not super happy with. Like, there is a bright future for you, and it's really achievable, but you got to make that decision first and then just keep showing up every day. Do I hear that correctly?
Yeah. So in the book, I have something called the bee and turtle effect. And it kind of goes right into the heart of what you're talking about here. So in the military, I'll use this analogy. I remember when we were planning for a mission and you're going to execute it, you are hyper focused at the point when you know you're walking into danger. And so these are like the big moments that you encounter. What I found is that we were most susceptible to ambush and to getting injured in the transition points in between, leaving base and completing the mission, and then vice versa. You get done the mission and you hit another transition point on the way back. And it's in those transition points when your guard is off and you're not as intense about the decisions that you're making that you open yourself up for harm. I think if you apply that to our lives, we tend to live for the big moments in life, and we don't take into account the transition points. So, to frame this as the bee and turtle effect, those big events in your life, getting married, graduating college, having whatever goal you set out to achieve it, that's the thinking of the long range tortoise, who they're very methodical about. They don't go anywhere fast, and they're slow in their prodding, and they're looking at the long range goal of where they're trying to get to. But then on the other side, you have this honeybee, and the honeybee is all about the 24 hours that they're present in right now. They're doing whatever they need to serve the hive and the mother bee. So I think where this magic happens is where you mirror the actions and choices that you're making in those transition points or the everyday moments of your life so that they start aligning with your shorter term ambitions and your longer term aspirations. And this locks directly in to behavior science, which really centers in on micro choices. It's not those big moments in life, those big exercises that define you. It's the micro choices that you're making every single day, and how are they guiding you? That's where your intentionality comes in. So that's why in the book I say you can have all the grit, passion, and perseverance as Angela Duckworth describes it, but if you're not intentional about the micro choices that you're making, where are you aiming that at? And that's where
Right.
intentionality starts shaping your days. So, in a nutshell, that is the key thing we have to learn: is how do you start doing a choiceology that not every choice is going to take you there, but if you start making more and more choices in the given direction you want to go in, they're going to start multiplying. Just like at the beginning, I said I needed to go to therapy for post traumatic stress. Well, when I went through cognitive processing therapy, it started having a ripple effect on other parts of my life. Because as I started to clear out those stuck points, I started working on other areas that then opened up, that eventually made me a better person. But it was micro action and micro choice that ended up doing it. And that is the key to change for any of us.
Mm. John, you are a wealth of information. And I thank you for stepping into that, because I know that maybe given the choice, you would not go through those two traumatic experiences again. I can't imagine anyone would willingly go through that. But, you've taken that experience, both of them, and used it to change the lives of thousands of people. So, tremendous honor to you for doing that and for stepping into it and owning that part of your story. It's an honor to have this conversation. And again, the work you do to help other people really step into themselves is nothing short of an honor to sit here. So thank you again.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for having me. And I think if there's one thing I could leave your listeners with, is we all think about success. And I'm sure a lot of people on this podcast are very concerned about success in their life. And I don't want to degrade it because we all want success. But you can have tremendous success and still be a half cake if it lacks meaning. So, my advice from someone who's painfully gone through this to the point that I was so emotionally numb, I was almost like my friend Tim and questioning, you know, life. Um, it's never too late to rethink the trajectory you are on, and it's never too late to start changing how you're showing up in your family and with your kids. And that maybe is the starting point for you to redefine that choiceology that you have in your life.
I agree. Wow, no words. I agree wholeheartedly. So again, man, thank you tremendously for that. Where can we support you and your books and everything else from there?
So, since we talked about the Mattering Verse, the two major projects coming out of that, you can go to youmatterluma.com if you want to pre-order the book. If you want to be part of the Ripple of Kindness Challenge, you can go to passtheripple.com. If you want to listen to the Passion Struck podcast, go to passionstruck.com. And if you want to learn more about me, you can go to my Substack at theignitedlife.net.
I love that. Well, again, tremendous honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.